you all meet?
Well, we were going to the same school, Pinedale School, and we met in high school. And
You in the same class? Or?
no, he was a little bit behind me because he would have to fall out now and then and work because his mother had 7 children and his daddy died when he was 42 years old. So all the children had to help work, and he was the 3rd, and she had 7. So every once in a while he'd have to fall out and get a job. So he was behind me. He should have been in my grade, but he was behind me. He never did get to finish school. He went to the 11th grade, but he never did that.
How did he ask for a hand in marriage?
Well, he said, I've been thinking about it. We ought to get married. And I said, well, maybe so. And so the next time he come, he went and bought the marriage license and brought him and showed me. I said, oh. He said, well, you said you'd marry me. I said, well, all right. And he said, when are we going to get married? I said, I don't know. I said, well, I just have to talk to my mother about that and kind of get things planned where I can. And he said, well, who will marry us? And I said, well, Hub will marry us. I know he will. That's my sister's husband. And they lived all around the bend from us. And so one evening, Mom was and I were getting wood in, and I said to her, I said, Mama, I think I'm going to get married. She said, oh, Erma, I was afraid of that. And she said, you hadn't even finished school. And she said, why now? I said, well, I didn't really mean to right now, but I said, Goley's got the license. So she said, well, your daddy will have a fit. Said he had his eye set on you to go to school. I said, well, Mama, so many of the kids get married now, and I said, they're getting secretly married. And they just stay at home till they get out of school. And that's what I'll do. Well, she said, what if your daddy finds it out? If you say Hub's gonna marry you, should you know he can't keep a secret. And she said he'd probably beat you to death. So I had asked my daddy for some money when we were out together, a month or so before that, for a new dress. And I always learned if I had waited till he got in front of his friends, that he tried to be as big shot as they was, you know, that he wouldn't say no. And so he gave me some money, and I went and bought me a blue wool flannel, I guess, dress. And it was 2-piece. I never will forget it. It was a pretty dress. It was a skirt and a top. And that's what I got married in. But whenever we went over to get married, Goley come after me in a Model A car. And he came over to Hub's. And I guess I don't know how I got over there. He didn't come to my house because Mom didn't let me. Don't know where we're in the car with the boy. And so sister said, Erma, I don't know what you ought not to go home with Goley. I said, well, I hadn't even planned on doing that. And she said, well, it might keep down a lot of disturbance, because Papa will really pitch a fit if he finds out that you're married. And said, you ought to think about that. So all that was right down Goley's eye. for me to go home with him. And so I said, well, I don't even have things to sleep in. I didn't bring anything to take. I don't have a toothbrush, I don't have nothing. And he said, well, I've got you a Christmas present. And he said, it's something you can sleep in. And he said, you can open that. So I went on with him, and it was so cold at night. Snow was on the ground, and the ground was all frozen. And when I opened my package, it was a silk pajama set, and it had it was kind of like a Chinese kimono and pajamas. And I'll tell you what, that was the coldest pair of pajamas I ever put on in my life. I like to froze to death. Whenever I got in bed, I never got warm. I was so cold. And then we got up the next morning, and Miss Montgomery and him got up, and she fixed breakfast for us. He stayed around a while. Then he asked me, could he go over to Uncle Joe's house, and where his cousins was, because he wanted to go over there and tell him he had brought me home with him. So I told him I didn't care. So he went over there and stayed a while around with them to tell him he was married and that I was over to his house. And I was afraid to go home for a long time. But Hub went over the very next morning, bright and early, and told my daddy that I had gotten married. And he was just real upset. Mom said he cried, and of course she was crying. And he said that he just didn't know what made me do that. And but he said, I'm gonna tell you. He said, I'm really put out with her. He said, she's made her bed hard, and I'm gonna let her lay in it. But when I did go home, why, he said those words to me, which hurt real bad, but he didn't mean a word of it. Because every time that a little disturbance come up, why, he was always at my rescue between me and Goley, or me and the Montgomerys. So Goley had already spoke to Uncle Claude about a house that he had built down there on his place for us to move in. So we got a few things together, and we moved in that house. But, and I missed the school bus a lot of times when it come by to go to school, because I was determined I'd go and finish school. And I'd have to walk across the woods in the pasture, getting to the school. But after I got married, really my heart was never in school. I just was too much. It was a new home and a new life and finishing school. And the basketball days were just about over with. And whenever I was going to school, that was my most fun out of school, was playing ball. And I was captain of our ball team. That was the happiest days of my life, whenever I could play basketball and be with all the girls. But the ball life was just about over. And come the farming part and the working hard part. And so whenever spring come, we had to try to put in the crop, and it was mostly cotton and corn and hay. And it rained all that year, just rained all the year. And we just didn't make our crop worth nothing. And at the end of the year, well, I just about had enough staying away from home. And I wanted to go home. And so we moved back up on my dad's place in a little shotgun house. And But before we moved, I already knew that I was pregnant with Lexi, my first daughter. And she was born in 1939, and February the 24th, 1939. And I really did need my mother and daddy after that, and during that time, because I was sick about 4 days and nights before Lexi was born. And the doctor was coming out to the house and deliver her, but they decided that I had been sick so long that something might be wrong and I need to go to the hospital. So she was born in New Albany Hospital by Dr. Shan. And there's a lot I didn't know about babies and things, and so my mother just was the greatest mother in the world. She just took over and helped me through all of it, and she helped me to make little clothes and get everything together for her. And she was my first grandchild. Wasn't Mama and Papa's first grandchild, but she was my first child. And so they all thought a lot of her. And we just had a real hard time during them times, but everybody else did, so we didn't think a lot about it, because it was just hard times, and it was, the depression came right after that, and so we made our own little clothes, made our own clothes. We canned, and we raised our own meat. We raised corn and took it to the grist mill and ground it. And really all we bought just about was flour and sugar and coffee. And so was our main staple goods that we bought. We raised everything else. We raised our dried peas, our dried beans, our dried butter beans, and dried our own apples, and canned everything else. So Brenda came along in 1941, and I remember when I found out I was expecting her, how disappointed I was, because Lexi I thought was the best thing that ever come in my life, and I just loved her so much till I thought I wouldn't be enough love to share with another baby. And I just didn't know what I was going to do with two babies. And but as time went on, and I had Brenda, I had her at home, and Dr. Williams delivered her, and she was born October the 26th, 1941, 1941, that's right. And so we moved from the little shotgun house up in the big house on my daddy's place. And we were making crops up there. Goley and Joel Dillard made a crop together on my daddy's place. And so we had some cows and mules and things. And when I'd get up in the morning and in the fall, he got him a job at the New Albany shirt factory. And so when I'd get up and get my children, well, the cows milked and hogs fed and everything, well, I'd wrap my children up in a big blanket or a quilt or something, and my mom would always be watching for me. And when I got through, she'd meet me about halfway up the hill and take one of the babies, because I'd be carrying both of them. And I'd go over there and stay all day long with her and eat dinner. And I'd sew and make their little clothes, and she'd help me with them. And I'd listen to the radio, the stories on the radio, and while I worked, and she had to work a lot outside because my daddy had a slaughterhouse and he had a dairy. But I'd help her with the dinner, and we'd usually wind up eating our evening meal over there before we went home. And I'd go back home and try to make a fire and take care of the kettle before Goley got off from work. And so I had two little children, and I loved them both very much. But one day we heard on the radio that the war was getting worse and worse, and then we heard that they bombed, the Japanese bombed in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Well, then my dad said, well, we're really in trouble. By that time, the Depression had hit, and he said, we're really in trouble. He said, because we're going to have a World War II. Sure enough, we did. Goley was drafted in 44, and but I guess he wouldn't have been had he not went to the shirt factory and got him a job, because they considered that he wasn't a farmer, that he was a worker in a plant. But there were some men in the community to their boys was having to go, but they weren't married and didn't have a family. And they was determined that if Goley was called, he was going to go. So Dad tried to his very best to keep him out, but these men, the day that he had to leave, they were there to protest if Goley got deferred. So he had to leave and go to war. So he was in Camp Fannin, Texas, near Tyler, Texas, for his basic training. And after he got drafted into service, well, I moved to New Albany, down the street from Miss Montgomery. And so I got me a little job at the shirt factory. But every day that I worked, Goley's sister Fairy kept them, and they would cry every morning when I went to work, and then they would cry and pray. We always prayed before we went to sleep, and prayed for Goley's safety. And they would pray when it was their time to pray that they'd be sick the next morning where their mother wouldn't go to work. So that didn't last very long. I quit work, and I said, well, we'll get by on $100 some way or another, and we did. We made it fine and saved some money, a little money out of it. $100 a month, that's what we got. I got $50, and they got $25 a pay. That was that was our check from the government. And that's how I saved the money to go. I saved some money out of that to go to where he was. But my mother always, she sent me, when we was living up there, she'd send me milk, and she'd send me butter, she'd send me vegetables out of the garden, and my daddy would give me meat off of the meat truck, and they seen that I didn't go hungry, that I had plenty to eat, and that helped out with the money part. And I think we lived with a older lady that was had never been married, and I think she charged me $10 or $15 a month for rent. I can't remember which one it was, but we had 2 rooms, a bedroom and a kitchen. which was fine for us. But the Montgomery kids stayed down there more than they stayed at home with us. But from there is when we left and went to where Goley was in Texas. And I can't remember if we stayed 3 weeks there or a month, but it wasn't too long. After he was there a while, he wanted me and the children to come to him. So my folks thought that that was too far for us to go, and for me with 2 little children. So they wanted me to write and asked him to get us a place to live. And he didn't ever get to leave the camp except on the weekends. And sometimes he had duty on the weekends. And he couldn't find us a place, but he said, you come on and we'll go to the USO and they'll find us a place to live. A train back then was just full of soldiers and soldiers' wives and their children. There wasn't many traveling except Army people, Navy people, people that were in service. And so I remember on the train, there was a real pretty lady, and she had a little girl, and I found out that she was from Memphis too, and she always, but she had already been down there and come back, and she was going back, and she didn't want to go back. There was a lot of soldier boys got around her and was kissing her and carrying on over, and they seen that she had a seat that would lay down so she could lay her little girl on it. Well, we didn't have one like that, and Lexi and Brenda both had to lay on me. And trains traveled so slow back then. There wasn't airplanes that would carry you places, and you went on a bus or you went on a train. And as I said, it took us a whole night, and so about 11 or 12 o'clock to get to Tyler, Texas. Well, the next day, we went to this motel, and so I wanted to find out about the motel and find some friends and talk to some people. So I talked to this one lady that told me the soldier's wife had got killed there in that motel, and she told me it was last week, and that somebody cut her head off. So that just frightened me so bad, because I had never been away from home. And then that night there was a door in between my room and the next room, and that door kept bumping all night long. And I had what little bit of money I had on me and besides that, I had my children. And I was so afraid. And I got the children to sleep, but I sat up all night long by the side of them and waited for that door to come open. So the next day, when the lady came around to clean our room, well, I talked to her about that, and she told me there was another soldier's wife over there too, and they had several children, and the bed was across that door, and she knew that they were kicking the door that made the door wiggle like that and make the noise. But anyway, we got out the next day. If you've never been to Texas in summertime, which was July or August 1, I don't know, remember what month it was, but it was so hot till you could hardly breathe. So we got out and started walking the streets to try to find us a place to live. And they asked him if we seen signs that they wanted somebody to stay with them. They'd have signs out, but when you'd knock on the door, they said no, they didn't want anybody with children. And we went back down to the USO before in a day or two. And so I told him I had to have a place to live or I had to go home. And so she said, well, I'm going to put you on the top list, and if anybody comes along that wants children, why, I'm going to let you know. So don't leave. You just sit out here. And the kids got so tired, and so Brenda reached over and, well, a little girl had a doll playing with it, and Brenda kept on looking at that doll, looking at it. And so finally she reached over and got the doll. And that little girl had made her so mad, and she grabbed her doll back. So Brenda, she didn't like that for nothing, so she spit on her. So that lady just told me off from beginning to end how I'd raised my children, because she'd never seen a child that would spit on another child. Well, Goley's brother was really the cause of that. He would play with her and he'd say, chicoo, chicoo, to her that way. So she picked up that spit from that playing with her. But anyway, I apologized, and so I moved away from where they were sitting, and the little kids were so tired, and that's why that lady called my name. And we went up there, and she said she had a lady there that lived out, and she wanted a soldier's wife with some children to go to live with them. And so she said it was just one room. And so I got on the bus with her and rode several miles out of town. And when we got there, well, I learned before we got there what the place was like. It was an old storehouse that had been on the side of the road, and she had the big part of it. And then there was another lady named Dolly, lived in one of the rooms in the back. The family had the store, had lived there, and they had 2 rooms at the back of the store. And she lived in one room, and the other room was vacant, and that was the one I was to live in. Well, there was a mattress there, and maybe a table, I cannot remember. But I didn't have any bed clothing or anything. So I got out and got me some sheets, and we slept on the floor on that mattress. And we stayed there 2 or 3 weeks. And then it was getting near time for Goley to come home and be shipped overseas. And we were so in hopes and praying that he would be shipped to another campsite or somewhere that he wouldn't have to go overseas to fight. But that was during the worst time of the war. And so when he came home, he had his papers that he was to go to Germany, Berlin, Germany. And he went over there, and it took him a long time to go. They went by boat, and it took him a long time to get over there. I don't know how many weeks it was, and get set up to where they could be sent out on the battlefield. But he was sent right away out on the battlefield, and he was on a machine gun. And then he said that they were another machine gun come down the alley and started firing on them, and he jumped off and started to run and fire back. And so one of the machine guns, the shrapnel, hit the concrete and bounced up and hit his feet and legs and bursted his shoes, and his feet and legs froze. But they were out, I don't know how many days and nights before they ever got to go back to their camp. And he told me about that he was in a foxhole one night, and he was he'd been out so long till he had mud. His beard had grown real long, and he had mud all over them. And his clothes was wet and muddy, and his feet was froze. And but he was down in this foxhole, and he kept hearing something. And he just knew that the enemy was near and would take his life in any minute. So he said he kept turning his head from one side to the other, listening. And he said that you never know the fear that's in your heart when you think that at any breath that your life might be taken. But he realized after a while that he didn't hear this noise till he turned his head, and he realized that it was scraping his collar from side to side every time he moved his head, and he realized that that wasn't the enemy, and that was what it was. But when he did go back to camp, why, they thought for a long time that they would have to take his feet and legs off, and I didn't hear from him a long, long time. And when I did hear, would just be a little photostatic copies. It wouldn't be his writing. They'd make pictures of the little note he'd write, and then they'd send it to me by airmail. And so many times the kids would run down the street to see if they could hear from their daddy, and the postman that would say, "No letter today." And they would run back to the house crying and say, "The postman said we had no letter today." Well, there was a song back then that was real popular, and whenever they say that, I couldn't help but cry, and sometimes I'd sing that little song, the chorus of it, "No letter today." And but he was in the hospital a long time, and he said his feet and legs were black up to his knees, and but as he stayed there and he couldn't walk, he had a rolling chair, and he was shipped from there to France, come through France. And he said he always heard the French women were so pretty. And he said he got up on his elbow and looked out to the train window to see if he could see any of them, see how beautiful they were. And but he stayed in the hospital more than he stayed out on the battlefront after he got wounded. The rest of his time he stayed in the hospital. So finally, the war was not quite so bad, and they thought that he wouldn't be of any use anymore, and they discharged him and sent him home with a small pension, which he was real thrilled about, that he was going to get a pension, and that would help us along till he could find a job. And but he wanted to move back out in the country, the very place we began our life, out in the same house on the same place. And that year was just like the first year that we got married. It rained all the year, and our crop just grew up with weed and grass till we made nothing that year. Well, he got out and got me some chickens, and he was going to let me raise some chickens. And so I got pregnant again, and I was real sick all that summer, and half those little chickens died. And was trying to make a crop, and Goley's brothers staying there most of the time, and my two children. Well, I had a miscarriage and lost the baby. And so after that, well, we moved from there back up close to town, on the outside of town, and he had got him a job at a service station up there. It's in New Albany, back up close to New Albany, Mississippi. We moved back up there, and he got him a job at a service station, working for $25 a week. And we lived with an elderly man and woman, and they were just so good to me. God always took care of us. And they didn't charge us much for rent either, and they had a garden. And their name was Mr. and Ms. Cox. And they just took me right under their wing, me and their children. And she cooked, she kept her grandchildren a lot, and she cooked big meals. And she was always coming over there, getting us and carrying us over there to eat with them. And she was a real good cook, and I surely enjoyed that. And so he had but he got him he had to have uniforms, and he had to pay for those uniforms. So he told J.P. McGee was the man that owned the service station, just to take so much out of his check a week till he paid for his uniforms. And he had to have pants, shirt, and a long coat. And he did that. Well, he got 2 of them, and I had to try to keep them washed. I'd wash one day and try to get it dry and iron it. And I didn't have electric iron. I had to use a flat irons, and didn't have a washing machine. I used a rub board and a tub, and then I'd get that one dry, and he'd wear that one the next day, and I'd wash the next one, the other one he pulled off, and I'd wash it and get it ready for him to go again. Finally, he thought he wasn't making enough money hard to keep us going, and he thought about buying him a truck. And it got summertime, and he said that he could deliver a lot of ice to a lot of the country people. They had ice boxes you put ice in, and he could make him some money that way. And of course he had a payment on the truck, and I said, well, you won't make enough money to make the payment on your truck. And he said, well, if I make the money to make the payment on the truck, I'll have a truck when I get through with the summer. And he did that, and we would ride with him for him to deliver the ice a lot of times. But whenever summer was over, that job was over. But them truck cut notes kept going. So he had to get rid of his truck. And the children went from there back to Enterprise School. And they was 2 guys that I had grew up with that was driving the school bus, and they would always stop in from the house and pick them up and see them up in the yard, and then they'd have the door open, and I'd meet them down there to put the children on the school bus. And one day, Brenda told me that she was going to be in a little program at the school, and she was needed a little bunny and a little long dress, and I can't remember what her part was. But anyway, Miss Cox, she was devoted to my children by this time, and she said, oh, Erma, I'll help you fix her up real pretty. And so we did. We worked on that little dress and that little bonnet and got it all ready. And Brenda forgot her date of the night that she was going to be in the program. So she told me the wrong time. So one day I met them at the school bus, and she was crying like her heart would break. And she said they had my program last night. And so I said, oh no. I said, no, your little dress and bonnet's all ready. And she, I know, Mama, but she said they had it last night without me. We have worked day and night, she said, getting her little outfit ready for that program, and she's missed the whole thing. Well, it was kind of upsetting then, but we had a big laugh about it later.